Hello everyone, I am the Bedded Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from the Warhammer 40k Commander Precons, Ghyrson Starn Kelermorph. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck techs, gifts, and more. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Ghyrson is a 3/2 Tyrannid human with Ward 2 for 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red. He has a very fun and interesting triggered ability that occurs whenever something you control deals 1 damage to a permanent or player. When that happens, Ghyrson deals 2 damage to that same permanent or player. While most people clamored ping or trimal when this was revealed, I thought about more global effects than simply creatures that can tap down to ping 1 any target. I tried to make the absolute most of Ghyrson's ability by maximizing the damage output as much as possible to make him the most dangerous member of Bolson's construction company. While I mentioned doing global damage, let's first go over the best single damage sources in the deck. One of my favorite ones here is Rocket Launcher. I'm kind of surprised this wasn't reprinted in one of these precons considering it's a rocket launcher and not on the reserve list. In any case, the only downside to this is not being able to activate as if it had summoning sickness, and then having to destroy it at the end of the turn you activated it. But that's not that big of a deal. You can essentially sink all of your mana into this to deal a potential total of 3 damage for each 2 mana you sink into it. Best of all, with how triggers work, you can respond to the beginning of the end step trigger on the turn before yours, sinking all of your mana into this. It will not get destroyed because the end turn trigger already happened, so you can then use it again in your next turn before it gets destroyed at the beginning of your end step. Desert and Balduvian trading posts are also included, and best of all, do not take up slots in your deck. Unfortunately, they can only ping attacking creatures, which isn't that bad since Ghyrson is going to deal it 2 more damage. The real downside is Desert being able to ping the creature only after it dealt combat damage. But like I said, no reason not to run it because it doesn't take up a slot in the deck. Niv Mizzet Draco Genius and Niv Mizzet the Firemind, on the other hand, can ping any target whenever they want. Draco Genius is even better rocket launcher but harder to pay for. As a bonus, you get to draw cards with each of these Niv Mizzet cards. The deck draws into a ton of cards, so don't worry about using these for card draw. The card draw is actually consequential and superb bonus when it comes down to it, but we'll see those effects later on. Karen Negotiations and Flame Fusillade are like Oprah and turn everyone into pingers. The enchantment is a static effect but only tied to creatures you control, while the sorcery is a temporary effect but affects all of your permanents. So you can tap artifacts, lands, planeswalkers, enchantments, and even heroes if you had them in order to ping things. I absolutely love these cards in this deck. They do a ton of work and can potentially help you end the game. That being said, the GOAT when it comes to pingers is Goblin Sharpshooter. The likelihood of you clearing the board with this is even larger thanks to Ghyrson. Essentially, any creature with toughness 3 or less is getting clapped. Actually, all of them because you can untap it whenever a creature dies, so you can potentially wipe out most of the creatures you don't control. Speaking of creatures dying, Hissing Iguanar and Spiteful Prankster take further advantage of that. Every time a creature dies, you can ping a player or planeswalker. This is amazing because the deck is constantly pinging creatures on opponents. But if you had to choose between pinging a creature or a player, these take the decision out of the equation by allowing you both if you're able to kill that creature. As for other triggered effects, the deck is running Flameblade Angel, Circle of Flame, and Woody Roastmaster. Getting hit with damage is not inevitable in a commander game, so the Angel makes sure to repay that too to opponents intent on dealing you damage. It's also a 4/4 flyer, which is nothing to scoff at. The enchantment punishes the non-flying creatures altogether before blockers are even declared. Good luck getting that weenie token army through. The Roastmaster might seem like it doesn't trigger often, but even if it's only triggering occasionally, it's still free damage. However, when combined with another creature we'll soon see, you can see just how epic it's going to be. Burning Earth and Mana Barbs are some more triggered effects, but these are possibly the meanest ones in the deck since they're so punishing. At least they're symmetric, so your opponents might not feel as bad when you're getting pinged by your own enchantments. That being said, they won't be so glad once Ghyrson gets lifelink, but more on that later. At least Burning Earth won't hurt us that much since there are 16 basic lands in the deck. It's 2 colored so we can run enough of them without getting color screwed. As for the global effects, let's start with the best pingers worth including. Thermal Alchemist, Brimstone Trebuchet, Lightning Rig Crew, Lobber Crew, and Nettle Drone. Each of these tap down to deal a potential total of 3 damage to the face of each opponent with Ghyrson in play. While there exists the potential to untap some of these, that's not really the goal. The goal is to block and then tap at the beginning of the end step before ours. That being said, we can use Jace's ingenious Mind Mage to untap them, and all of the rest of our creatures, with his second loyalty ability. Since he gains loyalty with it, we can do it each turn. Or we can also draw a card each turn if we needed to. His ultimate isn't really used, but it's still useful if we wanted it to be. That being said, he's mostly here for untapping and or card draw. Honorary mention to Shivan Gorge as well for pinging all opponents. The black sheep of the Gaia's Cradle Ceres Sanctum Tolarian Academy cycle, it can still find a home in plenty of decks, this one being one of them. It's a bit costly to do, but it doesn't take up a slot on the deck. Walder Automaton also requires mana to ping all opponents, but it doesn't tap to do so. This is an amazing mana sink to activate at the beginning of the end step before your turn. It's also relatively easy to activate since it only requires 1 red mana, with the rest of the 3 being generic. Rowan Skull of Sparks, Saheeli Rai, Sarkhan Dragon Soul, and Chandra Awakened Inferno can also each be activated to ping all opponents without requiring mana, but can only be used once per turn at sorcery speed. That being said, the first 3 do it via a loyalty ability that ups their count, so you can do it reliably each turn assuming they stick around. Combined with Ghyrson, that's 3 damage per turn to each opponent. However, Ghyrson doesn't mesh with Chandra's +2 ability because she gives an emblem. You don't control that emblem, the opponent does, so it will not trigger Ghyrson. That being said, giving this emblem to each opponent each turn will still add up, so she's still a good addition to the deck. That being said, her ultimate does work with Ghyrson. You can simply remove 1 loyalty for X in a pinch and that will trigger him. Goblin Chain Whirler and Voldaren Epicure can each hit opponents but when they enter the battlefield. The Goblin costs thrice as much, but that's because it also hits creatures and planeswalkers. While the deck doesn't have ways to blink creatures, these essentially behave like burn sorceries that you can then block with. Speaking of, Blazing Volley, Boiling Earth, End of Festivities, Scouring Sands, Smash to Dust, Overloading Electricity, and sending Fanged Dragon on an adventure will also hit all creatures for 1. I found these to be the best ones since you're essentially dealing 3 damage to each creature you don't control. That might not seem like much in a commander game, but it absolutely wrecks token strategies and hate bears. And they're also relatively cheap to cast, so you can still play other things and then ping whatever survives afterwards. The best one is End of Festivities since it also hits all opponents and only costs a single red mana to cast, really showcasing that power creep. Firebrand Archer, Keswick Flamebreather, and Lamholt Raconteur also ping all opponents but via a triggered ability. They all trigger whenever we cast a non-creature spell, which is 41% of the deck. The only downside to Lamholt Raconteur is when it transforms into Lamholt Ravager. It will now deal 2 damage, which still isn't bad, but it will just no longer trigger Ghyrson. But as Meatloaf once eloquently stated, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Butcher Orc has a very interesting and synergistic effect with Ghyrson, and I absolutely love it here. Since you can divide its combat damage however you want, it doesn't even need to connect or be blocked by specific creatures. With a base power of 6, you can simply send 1 to the defending player's face and 1 to 5 of their creatures, if you wanted to, or just send 1 up to 6 of their creatures. Then with Ghyrson, they'll each be receiving 3 damage total. This does some serious work because it has the potential of causing 18 damage around the board by simply dealing combat damage. Speaking of synergistic effects, there are no better cards to pair with Ghyrson than Tandem Lookout, Curiosity, and Ophidian Eye. Each time you're pinging an opponent for 1 damage, Ghyrson pings them for 2, netting you a card. If you activate an effect or cast a spell that pings each opponent for 1, then you're drawing 3 cards each time. Imagine any of these auras attached to him when you're activating any of the global pinging effects mentioned earlier. 2 busted. Oh, and imagine doing so with the Locust God in play. Each time you draw a card, you create a 1/1 flyer with haste. If that weren't enough, considering that Ghyrson will deal 2 damage on top of the 1 dealt by the Locust token, imagine drawing a card each time, which then creates more Locust tokens. So if you swung with 5 of his tokens, you dealt 5 plus 10 damage for a total of 15 damage, plus you drew 5 cards, creating 5 more tokens. Crazy. Even then, if you're not inserting the Locust God in this engine, it's still amazing on its own, since it can grow a huge insect token army that will help deal 3 damage each time to the defending player. Speaking of, remember Witty Roastmaster? Each time you create that instinct token, you ping each opponent for 1. These maths are insane. So let's put it into perspective. Let's say you have Ghyrson enchanted with Curiosity, the Locust God, and Witty Roastmaster on the battlefield. With 1 Locust God activation, you're looting for 1, creating that initial Locust token. When it enters the battlefield, it triggers the Roastmaster, dealing 1 damage to each opponent, triggering Ghyrson. Doing so has him deal 2 damage to each opponent, drawing 3 cards. This then triggers the Locust God, creating 3 more Locust tokens, starting the cycle all over again until you kill off the entire table. Since Curiosity is a you may ability, you can stop before decking yourself in case anyone has more life than you have cards left in your library. You can also swap in Impact Tremors for Witty Roastmaster in this combo. It's still a great card to include in the deck as well, since it has the same effect as Witty Roastmaster, plus enchantments are harder to get rid of than creatures. Shadow Spear, Gorgon's Head, and Basilisk Collar are the next best cards to pair with Ghyrson. If Ghyrson had Death Touch, then any damage that pings a creature triggering Ghyrson will then have Ghyrson kill that creature. Giving him lifelink is absolutely ridiculous. You'll be gaining an insane amount of life, which will help you once you obtain Archenemy status. But even then, if you're killing off each creature in the table, it's going to be really difficult to kill you anyways. But it's interesting to see a non-white deck gain as much life as this one can. Swiftfoot Boots, Champion's Helm, and Hammer of the Zon are more equipment to equip Ghyrson with. These aren't as epic as the previous ones, but they'll still protect Ghyrson in later turns. While he has Ward 2, soon enough players will accumulate the mana to be able to pay that tax. The following cards are needed by every commander deck, which are the deck's card advantage, interaction, and mana acceleration. While we've already seen how epically the deck can draw cards, we still need non-synergistic and independent ways of doing so. Stroke of Genius, Drown in Dreams, and Pull from Tomorrow fit the bill and are great here because they're not as intense in its requirement of blue mana to cast, especially since we need to keep as much blue open for our counter magic. On that note, Fierce Guardianship, Swan Song, Negate, Counterspell, and Mana Drain form a decent enough counterspell suite. There aren't that many spells nor effects that can really set the deck back, but we're pretty slow, so we have to prevent that combo player from winning. For all else, we can just overload Cyclonic Rift. We can ping creatures, planeswalkers, and players, but not enchantments nor artifacts. And while this might seem like too few cards, we're drawing into so many cards we're bound to not draw only into these, but keep them all, thanks to Thought Vessel, Decanter of Endless Water, and Reliquary Tower. These not only help us keep any fat hand once our engines are online, but are also helpful in terms of mana acceleration, especially in a non-green deck like this one. Soul Ring and Arcane Signet are the remaining mana rocks, while Wayfarer's Bauble, Navigation Orb, Burnished Heart, and Canoptech Wraith provide land-based mana acceleration. Be careful with the Wraith though, it is not like the Heart. You have to choose a basic land you already have in play to fetch the ones it gets you. It's pretty easy to overlook that detail, so keep that in mind. Speaking of, the rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 7 fetch lands, Steam Vents, Molten Tributary, Volatile Fjord, Training Center, Cascade Bluffs, Command Tower, and Ancient Tomb, as well as 8 of each basic land due to all of the basic land ramp in the deck. And as with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Ghyrson Starn Kelermorph. While you can definitely build this as a Pinger tribal deck like a Commander legal version of my Alexander Clamilton deck, which you can find a video for in the link above, I decided to go a bit wider with global pinging effects. You can still do pretty much the same thing like wipe the board, while the death by 1,000 cuts also approaches much quicker too. But if you still want Pinger tribal, try my Alexander Clamilton shell, pun intended, and swap him out for Ghyrson with a couple of recent updates and you're good to go. That being said, if you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.